Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we just talked about on the last episode taking massive action. I said it's important to take massive action, but we didn't really talk about what does that look like with your personality type. So as you are working on your personality, as you're learning to grow and develop yourself and move through the world, what does it mean to take massive action for the self, like inside of your type, inside of your personality?
Well, okay, I'm going to go to a theoretical place, but I think the big question is, how does one take massive action if the tool they're using is primarily an introspection tool for individuation? Yeah. Meaning that the purpose of personality types is an access point to your psyche. So if we are talking about personality types and talking about all these concepts of, like understanding how you're pre-wired and your preferences and your type and that sort of thing, how is that compatible with taking massive action? Yeah. I think that's an understandable question a person could ask.
It's like take massive action and go meditate on your inner space.
Yeah.
How do you take massive action and also meditate? Aren't you supposed to not do stuff?
Yeah, right. The whole point of it is to unplug and get someplace else and understand who you are. And I don't think that the chasm between those two concepts is quite that big. I think most people are, interested in type systems in order to be able to improve their relationships, improve their understanding of how they're going to move through the world, to help them make better decisions, right? What's my career going to be? Who am I supposed to end up with? So obviously there are decision points that we can apply this information to, but the idea of taking massive action, how does that work, right? And you said, how do you do that for your personality type? And I would say, how does anybody do that? How do they take massive action when they're trying to understand themselves more?
I think there's a body-mind connection. So I look at it. So first of all, maybe I have a distinction between action and outer world impact or results. I don't necessarily conflate those two things. Like actions are the things maybe I'm doing, and that could be an internal thing I'm doing, quote unquote, versus an external thing I'm doing. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily a physical manifested like result in the outer world. I think we definitely think that action looks like outer results. And yet there's a little bit of truth to that. Like, and for me, I want to find ways, even if I'm ruminating on the inner space, I still want to somehow connect it, like body mind almost, like connect it to my physical body, connect it to something that's outwardly expressed or moved, because I think that there's this connection. There's almost a yin yang element. If I want to feel happier, I can take action inside of myself and reframe my emotions and thoughts to feel better and smile, or I can externally smile with my face and it sends a signal to my brain that I feel happier. So you could actually use your body to feel better and reverse engineer it, or you can use your mind and your emotions to feel better and come this way. So I think that kind of is how I'm thinking about it as far as taking action with your personality. There's like an inner way going out and an outer way going in.
Yeah. Well, and processes that lead to good results, I think, are still actions. Like if you're running a process, even if that process is not something that other people can really observe in the outside world, you're still taking an action for yourself because you're running a process. You're figuring something out. You're honing something. And the goal, right, the hope is that the outcome will be that those processes will lead to better output, right? And so eventually a person will see the results, but they might not see the process occurring as you're working on it.
So let's use that as an example. So you're an ENTP in the Myers-Briggs system. When you decided to develop your personality, to focus on the wiring of your mind, you took massive action around your co-pilot or auxiliary, Antonia. I did too, but I'm just going to reference you right now because I've got a different co-pilot, different auxiliary. Your auxiliary co-pilot is a function technically called introverted thinking. We've nicknamed it accuracy. It's an internal process. It's about what's internally logically consistent for you. So how does this look like? How does massive action, let's start maybe with a personal example. How did you take massive action to grow this aspect of your internal logic when it's all introverted stuff?
Yeah. No, that's I think that's a fantastic place to start, which is an example that will, I believe, illustrate the point that we're ultimately going to be driving to. In order to gain my my thoughts back, in order to gain an ability to program my own mind and discover what made true analytical and logical sense to me when I stopped outsourcing that to other people in behalf of relationships. The only way to do that was to physically remove myself from a context and socially remove myself from a context that was too high pressure, that didn't really give space for me to do that. So in order to do work in my inner world, I had to change my outer world circumstances and environment. And I would argue that that was probably of all the massive actions I've taken in my life, that was the biggest, right? That had the most implications. It had the most, one could argue devastating results in the moment. It was massive action. And I had to do it in order to set the context for me to do that inner work. So I think that really does actually illustrate the point and answer the question, which is, how does one take massive action if they're understanding themselves and if they're individuating and understanding their own psyche? And the answer is, in order for us to, it's that phrase, you can't unsee certain things. Once you have access to parts of yourself that were previously unconscious, or once you have language to things that you might have understood about yourself in a feeling sort of way, but now you understand it with greater articulation. Now that encourages you to you have to act in accordance with that. Otherwise, you create your own cognitive dissonance. In order to make sure that you're honoring this increased self-awareness, if your outer world does not reflect it, if, say, your persona, which is the access point to the rest of who you are internally, if your persona does not match the rest of your psyche, you will create dissonance and everything will suffer. It's like it pulls a drain on everything. So in order to do any sort of internal work, any sort of individuation work, then you have to do persona work, which is how you show up to the world. And that's going to be a lot of action, right? That's going to be a lot of decision making and the things you're choosing to do.
So then the first step then is context we're talking about. And I did the same thing. I had to change my context. I had to change my physical life to be able to access my co-pilot or auxiliary. And again, we're just taking one aspect of personality right now in one typology system. So we're taking personality, we're going to the Myers-Briggs system, then we're going down into the car model inside the Myers-Briggs system, and we're isolating the auxiliary or co-pilot because we, through coaching, Antonia, have discovered it's one of the best avenues for growth for most people. And so we always start there. When we're giving advice to clients and our students, we talk about grow your co-pilot auxiliary function first, focus on that, and then move into the other areas of your personality and life. And so getting into the right context for that part of you to be expressed or to be grown is important. Having that as an introverted process, like both you and I have, it takes a little bit more intention and effort. I think people that have that co-pilot auxiliary as an extroverted process, it's a little bit like more straightforward, like just go do these things because it's extroverted activities. But getting that context right, I think, is important. And then I guess what I would say to make make what you said maybe more simple, the next phase would be, or maybe you didn't say this, I'm saying this, put yourself in situations where you will be triggered around the subject matter and energies that function deals with. So for example, for you, Antonia, introverted thinking or accuracy as your co-pilot auxiliary, if you can put yourself out of the main context you're in and then specifically take action to put yourself into contexts that will trigger your own logical fallacies for yourself. So you can kind of see, oh, I'm kind of an idiot when I just said that. That's not true. That's a logical fallacy inside of myself. Like a situation that mines that out of you, particular to introverted thinking accuracy. Now you're able to see how you're lying to yourself by putting yourself in those contexts. And for me as an ENFP, my co-pilot auxiliary function is technically called introverted feeling. Authenticity is the nickname we've given it. It would be good for me to put myself, and I did this growing myself, put myself in context to see what's authentic for me or not. To see, oh, that is not me at all. I feel very icky about that decision I just made or how I treated that person. Ugh, I triggered myself to go, ugh, or wow, that resonated. I feel deeply in alignment with that, right? I feel like that is something that is part of my identity and I want to do more of that. So I put myself in these contexts to get myself triggered.
Yeah. Well, and you can't unsee it. right?
Yeah.
Like once you have that self-awareness, it's impossible, or it's not impossible, you can do it, but it's really painful to act in a way that is out of alignment with what you just discovered about yourself. And that includes relationships, that includes career paths, that includes like every aspect of your life, because we're the starting point of the rest of our lives. We're the one constant that moves through the environment and all of these other things that we're experiencing and dealing with. And so self-awareness is a trigger point to massive action. Well, it's a trigger point. Lack of self-awareness also leads to massive action. A lack of self-awareness leads to all sorts of actions. We just don't know what those things are. Like Carl Jung said, that we do these things, without making them conscious, we call them fate. And so we're already actually in some ways taking massive action. It's that understanding more about how we're wired and our personality type allows us to take the right actions. It's almost like, don't just take massive action, take the right massive action. And I think a greater understanding of how we're wired helps us do that. I think the other thing is we just did a whole series of podcasts on this, on taking massive action, or at least understanding type as a way to guide us through our lives. And I suspect that the reason why we're so on this right now is you and I are getting to a place where it's almost like we can't just keep talking about type anymore. We just can't do that, right? It's not enough. And we have also seen how our personality types have influenced us to take both the right and the wrong actions. And when we take the wrong action, we go, why? Well, we know so much about type. Why did we do it that way? Like, we know this about ourselves. Why did we allow ourselves to get caught up in this thing, right? Like, oh my gosh, there it is again. There's my introverted sensing or memory. Like, I'm not finishing projects. I'm not doing them well. I'm not paying attention to details, right? Or there it is. My extroverted feeling of harmony has gotten me to not say things the way I needed to say them because now I'm playing the game again, or whatever it is, right? Your extroverted thinking or effectiveness gets you caught up in all sorts of business things that it's like, that wasn't the right action. I should have done something different. And an understanding of our type does definitely mitigate certain things. But unless we are using our awareness of how we're wired to make better decisions and take actions that allow us to calibrate faster, because taking massive action allows us to make the mistakes we need to make in order to understand the reality of all of this. Yes, I know that extroverted feeling or harmony is my 10-year-old or tertiary function. I know I have a tendency to, want to soft sell some of the things I think and make it so that people can't come after me for my objectionable opinions and that sort of thing. I know I have a tendency to do that, but the awareness of that doesn't, like, it's not that I'm already or automatically going to just not do that behavior until I start taking action and saying the things that I really think and maybe making objectionable, content someplace or whatever, something that's true to me. And I get that pushback. And then I've got to go, do I really believe this? Do I really feel this way? Do I really think this? And if the answer is yes, then I can't go back to soft selling anymore, right? And it's only through action that I understand those things. Even my internal processes, it's only through action that I get a reflection from the outside world that tells me this was the right or wrong thing to do. And I mean, part of this is also giving ourselves permission to make mistakes. But that's what massive action does, is it gives you an opportunity to play out how much of this has been theoretical and how much of this is actually applied information. How much can I turn into wisdom, not just data and information, but actual true wisdom, where I'm moving through the world with this information as like a supplement to all of the other sage advice that I'm using.
Yeah. And I think that, again, the introverted processes, we've talked about yours as a co-pilot auxiliary, which is introverted thinking, accuracy, mine, which is introverted feeling or authenticity. ETJs and EFJs, or ESJs, are going to have introverted sensing or memory as their co-pilot auxiliary. That's also an introverted function. It's not even about decision-making. It's about perception. It's about perceiving or learning. And ENJs are going to have the co-pilot of introverted intuition. We've nicknamed introverted sensing memory, introverted intuition, perspectives. And there's also action you can take here too, with these two functions. I would say with the introverted sensing or memory, my son, Sawyer, about 14 at the time of this recording. He's an ESTJ most likely. He's still young, but we're pretty sure he's probably an ESTJ. And his growth path means I want to help him as a father access his introverted sensing or memory process. Well, it's introverted, it's perceiving. What can he do there? Well, one of the activities that I work with him on is creating timelines of his life. I have him sit down and I have him write out on paper the different aspects of his life, the different moments of his life, the key moments that define him as a person, that impacted his collective understanding about himself and about the world. And walking through those and mapping those out is an action he can take to exercise that process. Even though it's an internal introverted process, there's still things he could do in the outer world to reflect back to him about that co-pilot. For an ENJ, it might be something like going to a float tank, a sensory deprivation tank where you shut off all your sensory information and you get into your inner space. You let your mind wander and bubble up intuition for you. And when you do that, you're taking action by going to the actual place where there's a float tank or sensory deprivation. Like you're taking action to put yourself in the context for these things to surface for you in your co-pilot. And again, we could talk about the 4 extroverted functions. I think they're so much easier. I envy the introverts of the world that get to just go do stuff to grow themselves. They don't envy themselves, I'm sure, because they're like, I got to go do stuff to grow myself. I just want to stay in my introverted state. But I envy them because I'm like, oh, that's great. I'm an extrovert. I like to do lists. I like to go do actions in the outer world. So that makes sense to me. So of course I'm going to want to go that direction. And introverts wish they could stay there. And it's probably the flip for introverts.
Yeah. Yeah. So no matter what it is, you can take action based on this increased self-awareness. But you and I were talking about okay, so what are the phases? If a person is going to use this to do, as Carl Jung talked about, individuation, which is discovering who you are and your whole self. Well, what are these phases? What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to set up a map? And we have come to the conclusion after doing lots and lots of mentorships that the best path of growth basically looks like this. And I'm about to, in maybe 5 or less, 10 or less sentences, I'm about to say something that is a literal lifetime's worth of work. All right, so I'm gonna lay out the map for the rest of your life, at least when it comes to individuation.
You remember that old 80s commercial from when we were kids, that game Othello? It takes a minute to learn and a lifetime to master.
Right.
That was like the tagline for it.
Yes, exactly. That's what this is. Individuation is a minute to learn and a lifetime to master. Yeah, exactly. Oh, I like that. So the first thing is you have to make sure that your dominant function, your driver function in the car model, is being honored in your life. Right? If it's not being honored, you're SOL. This is the function that you are most identified with. It is where you generate your energy. It is how you understand how to solve problems. And it is the place that we go when we're looking for ourselves.
You're already down the road, by the way. They've already discovered their 4-letter code dichotomies, right? And then they know their car model itself, which are the 4 cognitive functions that influence how you learn information, how you make decisions. And then you're talking about the next step on that journey, which is the growth step.
Okay. Back up. The first thing, if you would like to use this model as a map for the rest of your life, is the first thing is you discover your best fit type. And that is step 1, absolutely. And by the way, that all by itself can take years.
Yeah.
Right. That all by itself can be its own project. And there are many people who are pulling their hair out trying to figure out their best fit type. So there is advantages and disadvantages to that, by the way.
And by the way, growth can help with that.
Mm-hmm.
Getting on the growth path anyway can also help reverse engineer best fit type.
For sure. So best fit type all by itself is step 1. You're right. Okay. So then step 2 is to discover your Jungian cognitive functions that are associated with your best fit type. And your best fit type all by itself is going to give you a ton of information.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm an introvert. That explains 50% of the things that have ever gone wrong in my life, right? Or I'm an extrovert. Okay, that explains so much why, COVID made me want to blow my brains out or whatever it is, right? Okay, so that's the first thing. The first thing is discover your best fit type. Get all of those warm, happy chemicals that come from understanding yourself a little bit more, diagnose these big sort of chunks in your life and why you were the only thinker in a feeler family, and so they all think you're a terrible person, or vice versa, same deal, they all think you're a terrible person.
It's the validation stage of type.
Yeah, it's the permission.
I'm not broken. I'm just different.
Yeah, and it's going to be okay, and that's all right. And I get to like give myself permission to be that person. Okay, so you're right. That's step 1. Okay, step 2 is going, it goes further down the rabbit's hole. There's more to learn. There's more ahas and permission to be had. Gimme, num, 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 right? And so then that's like the next phase, which is getting into your cognitive functions, the mental processes that you come pre-wired with that tell you what aspects of reality and life that you come out of the blister packaging just being fascinated by. All right, so that's step 2. And then once you realize that there is a modality here, right, there's like a whole process, that there are certain functions that precede other functions, and those are your favorites, and you get a good definition for those things and go, oh, this is my dominant driver function. You learn the car model, which makes your life a lot easier. And then you use those functions, that understanding of those functions, to get to the part where I just jumped to, assuming that everybody in our audience is already there. But I'm glad that you reminded me that there might be newbies that are just entering this phase, and there's a whole world in front of them, which is kind of interesting and fascinating and exciting. Okay, so I backed up. Now I'm at the place I was before. So the first port of call after you get through the introductory phase of learning your best fit type and giving yourself permission, all that stuff, which again can take literally years. Then you get to that place where you go, what is my dominant function? And the most important aspect of this is that you make sure that your life is ergonomically designed to honor that function. And that all by itself might be massive action. That's a big part of why I graduated from the religion of my youth, is not just that it wasn't gelling with my introverted thinking or accuracy, which is what we were hinting at. That's the work I had to do. But really, the context didn't honor my dominant function. And so it effectively hemorrhaged me out, meaning that because I didn't have a situation that allowed me to feel like myself, then I was not able to stay there.
We recorded an entire podcast about this, by the way, years ago, talking about types in religion as just a specific audio podcast that you might want to go, if you're listening along, you might want to go listen to. We talked about how a religion that honors your dominant, you're going to probably stick with. And if it doesn't honor your dominant or driver, you're probably going to end up leaving at some point. And you could almost see clusters of certain personality types in religions and certain types that aren't in religion, like clusters of like heavy thinking types often are not assembled in religions, like groups of them, because their dominant function is just not honored inside of those structures.
Right. But religions that do honor that dominant thinking type will keep those types in there for longer, for sure. Yeah. And so I think folded into that podcast years ago is this idea that it's not just your paradigm or belief structure, your religion, it's any context, right? Does it allow you to really be in that function, to really manifest it, to grow it, to use it as, as John Beebe would call it, a hero function, right? Like something that allows you to solve problems and show up and be honored and celebrated. That's really important. So that's for the first protocol. And just like finding your type and then giving yourself permission to be that type can take years. Creating an ergonomic environment that honors and celebrates your dominant function and allows you to be there can take years. We're diagnosing entire life changes. I talked about leaving a religion that wasn't very kind to me when I left, right? I ended up losing everybody in my life. And so that was a many-year process. So again, a minute to learn, a lifetime to master.
So then after you have your dominant covered, your driver process covered, that's when we kick over to what we call the growth place in your personality, the co-pilot auxiliary function. And we found that, this is a part of you that's not necessarily the hero of your life. It's not where you live all the time. If the dominant or driver, in a metaphor, you could almost associate it with like a fish inside of water. It's the water you swim in. You almost aren't as aware of it. You're aware of it when it's missing, but when it's there, it's almost like, yeah, this is how reality works for me. The co-pilot or auxiliary is a little bit different because it's something that you're attuned to, but you're more conscious of. You're more conscious that you're in that process or you're not. And sometimes it's something we avoid because it's the opposite attitude of our driver or dominant. So if we're an introvert, that means our driver or dominant function is going to be introverted. By definition, that means our auxiliary or co-pilot will be extroverted. And we might resist it because it's like, well, now I've got to get extroverted to grow that part of me, and just flip it for extroverts. I'm an extrovert, meaning my dominant or driver is an extroverted process. And so for me to slow down all the go, go, go that I want in life, to get quiet, to take action in that more introverted place of my authenticity or introverted feeling, well, that can be a challenge for me. And so I sometimes resist that and skip past it. And this is why we put a lot of emphasis on this process, is because this, we found in all of the years of coaching and guiding students and clients, we found this is the highest bang for your buck. This gets you the best return on investment of pouring into the self.
Yeah. Well, and we tend to use it in behalf of others. Like the energy associated with this function is usually service to other people. And one of the reasons why we tend to skip it is because it gives us a sense of responsibility. The other thing is that we forget to apply it to the self because we are sort of pre-wired to think of it in terms of helping other people. There's a moment when we're like, oh, maybe I should be using it to help myself too, which is what happened to both of us. We mentioned before, my co-pilot's introverted thinking or accuracy. I was using that function for a long time to help other people understand concepts that I didn't even believe. I was like, here, let me explain it to you and break it down for you.
Out of the Bible, here's how this works.
Right. And then later on, I was like, maybe I should be using this to figure out things for myself. And once I started to apply it to the self and made myself part of the group of people who needs to be serviced by this function, everything changed. So on some level, leaving my previous life in order to honor my driver was a mini-year project. But so was figuring out what I actually believed myself, like what was authentically true and honest for myself. That was also a mini-year project. So that was huge. And Jung talks about the importance of this function. And when we get to what we call the 3-year-old, I'm going to reference back to it. But this is a critical function for us. It's not something that we can make a choice to avoid. We really shouldn't create identity around not being, associated with this function, because it's going to be critical and crucial for basically what I would call step 4. So after the co-pilot, then the next place we go is a balancing act between our co-pilot and our 10-year-old function, what's technically called the tertiary. And that, I think, is a lifetime to master. The balancing act between the co-pilot and the 10-year-old I don't think it's work we ever stop doing.
Well,
and
I would, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I would say that it's probably a early workload to get it balanced initially. And then what it is, it's a lifetime of maintenance and refinement. But it probably isn't like hard work for a lifetime.
Yeah. Well, right. Exactly. It's like when you first start working out. It's the early part where you're kind of figuring out, okay, what's the right exercise regime for me? What's the right nutritional, diet for me? What should I be doing here? And in the early days, you're just trying to familiarize yourself with it, and so it takes a while to figure sort of the whole balancing act out at all. Yeah. Right. But then over time, you have to maintenance, and then you go, oh, I could actually be doing this a little better. I could be doing this a little better. Oh, there I go again. I don't have my tension point between these two things balanced, but and it's an important part of who we are, so we don't want to neglect it, but it needs to be, it really needs to understand its proper place, and that's the next part of development. Yeah,
and so after we balance the 10-year-old and the co-pilot, now we kick over to the final part of the CAR model of the cognitive, what's technically called the cognitive function stack, which is the 3-year-old or inferior cognitive function, or the process that lives there. It's the exact opposite of the driver or dominant function. So this is something that's a part of us, and it definitely shows up in, I guess how I would say it here is it's extremely an uncertain place for most people. Like when we're here in this part of ourselves, we're deeply uncertain. So we do one of two things. We either avoid it, kind of like not want to look at it, or we oversimplify it. We create like really simple rules for it. I mean, well, we do more than those two things, but those are the two general ways people approach it, right? Either push it away or just oversimplify how this process works or idealize it or something like that.
Yeah, I think uncertainty is one of the best ways to understand this function, because we can watch ourselves in a general moment of uncertainty and observe our tendency when we are responding to that feeling. And some people ignore anything they feel uncertain about, and some people hyper-focus on anything they feel uncertain about. And so that's the binary relationship we have with this function, is either we ignore it or we hyper-focus on it, and it takes over. Both of those are wildly inappropriate relationships with that function. And so the final step in the CAR model is to integrate that part of who we are, which is make peace with uncertainty. Make peace with this part of who we are that is going to encourage us to take actions that we are not certain of the outcome of those actions, and it feels wrong and off. And again, we're talking about, to some extent, a lifetime worth of management. Just like getting that balance right between the co-pilot and the 10-year-old is a lot of upfront cost to set it up, but then a lifetime of maintenance. The same deal with that fourth function. It is a high upfront cost to be able to figure out, all right, this area of life, there's a whole area of life represented by this function, and I'm just not connected to it. And whenever I think about it, it makes me feel really uncomfortable, and it makes me feel way out of my depth. So I'm either going to pretend that that part doesn't exist and outsource everything to somebody else, or I'm going to fret about the implications of my inability to get this down. And the actual place we want to land is somewhere between those two places. We want to land in a place where we go, I'm never going to feel certain here, but I do need to have this. I need to develop a relationship with it. I need to understand its needs and wants. I need to not just go here when it's suddenly reared its ugly head like a beach ball underneath water in a pool that suddenly bursts up and now it's a big problem. Or in a situation where the world demands me be good at this and I haven't spent even one iota of time trying to figure that out. And I'm now hitting like a place of critical mass with this. And those are very common relationships we build with this part of who we are. So integrating this is the next piece. And that's a lot of work. That's a lifetime of maintenance. But what's beautiful about doing that is there are many Jungian analysts that call this the gateway to the shadow or the unconscious. Just think of the shadow as the unconscious. And we oftentimes have an unconscious relationship with this part of who we are. It's unconscious, and the ways it shows up is unconscious. So if we can take the lessons of it and start to integrate it and start to pay attention to it, we can suddenly realize that there is a whole world of a deep unconscious that's available to us. And this was like the first opening. It's the first time we start to cross the bridge over into that place.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about understanding type in general, your dichotomy, your CAR model, like the cognitive functions that show you how you learn information and make decisions. That's kind of the first setup. Then we talked about working through these items, deal with your driver, your dominant, your auxiliary co-pilot, balancing the co-pilot 10-year-old, and then coming over and working with the 3-year-old or inferior to integrate it. Because, as you just said, Antonia, if you get to that level, now you have access to the shadow self. You have access to all the parts of you that are way more murky. I mean, you want to talk about the 3-year-old being a hard thing for us to grasp as people. Like as we look at our personality type in that CAR model. And by the way, if you're a new listener and you don't know what we're talking about with the CAR model, just go over to personalityhacker.com and just search CAR model, and there'll be some information on what we're talking about, how you can find your CAR model for your type.
Well, and if you're a new listener, Joel just used the phrase dichotomy, and what he meant by that is your 4-letter code.
Yes.
So when you discover your best fit, we called it your best fit type, but like I'm an ENTP and Joel's an ENFP, or those are the preferences we have. Each one of those letters stands for a different dichotomy: introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, and judging and perceiving. So that first element is to get your dichotomies accurate and to understand your 4-letter code.
Yeah, it's almost like the reference point on a map to know more detail. Like it's like a decoder ring. It shows you where to look to find the cognition of your mind. That 4-letter code does. So when you start to work and integrate your 3-year-old or your inferior, John Beebe calls it the anima or animus, right? This is the part of us that is the animation of our lives almost. And I think there's also some conversations around it being our, what's that called? Aspiration. That's the word I'm looking for. The aspirational element. So this is a really interesting and important part of our personality in our CAR model. But there's a whole set of functions, 4 of them, that live in our shadow that we don't have as much direct access to. It's a little murkier. And so having a really good understanding of the car model, understanding the personality aspects that we can get in touch with and grow, I think gives us a better point to work with some of the shadow material that starts to surface.
Yeah. And I think this leads us to phase 2. So what we talked about with all that stuff, which is like a lifetime of mastery, that's phase 1. Phase 2, which you can do concurrently with when you get to a certain point of phase 1, primarily I would say when you start to really understand what it means to integrate that 3-year-old function, that inferior function. And you gain access to the concept of the shadow. You start to realize that there is all this terrain, all this territory within yourself that you didn't even know existed, or you othered, which is creating a distinction between yourself and that thing. And when we other it, that's divided, right? And individuation is bringing divisions back together. It's like it literally means not divided. And so when we're trying to individuate, when we're trying to understand ourselves separate from other people, but as a whole individual, right? As a whole, complete, not divided self. All that stuff that's in the shadow, all that stuff that's unconscious, it needs to be at least acknowledged that it exists. And when we don't do that, we tend to project it onto other people and go, that's not me, that's everybody else. And all those people are super obnoxious. I don't like any of those people. Not knowing that they're simply reflecting back to us all the stuff that we don't like about ourselves. So, and looking at it through the lens of individuation, I would still say that that order of phase 1 works, right? Our first individuation is recognizing that our dominant function, our driver function, is different from other people. This makes me special. This makes me different from others. And I might run into people who share my same driver function, and I go, oh, you're really similar to me. That's fun. But that's the first thing that we go, I'm unique, I'm different, I'm special, right? And that's our first level of individuation. And then we work all the way through those cognitive functions. And as we do that, as we go through the car model, we're going to be put into circumstances and situations because we're not going to not be able to take action on it. You can't unsee certain things. Once you understand aspects of yourself, it's really hard to stay in an unconscious state. It's really hard to stay in a place where you're not being honored, that these aspects of yourself you've discovered, other people don't give two craps. They're like, I don't care, keep doing the thing I want you to do. And it's like, that doesn't work for me anymore because now I understand what I want. Now I understand what my purpose is, where I fit in this ecosystem. And it becomes unacceptable to stay in bad places. And every change we make, almost always when it's a change for ourselves, it's a change that honors who we are, it involves a big ecosystem change. It involves other people getting to know us just as we're getting to know ourselves. It means other people can't manipulate us as easy. It means that other people can't, insinuate we should be doing things that we now know we shouldn't be doing. And that will create conflict. It will create a clarity of the paths that we should be taking, especially if we've been on the wrong path.
Yeah. I think, so what I'm hearing in what you're saying, like how I would contextualize this or how I would come up with an action step if I were to apply this to my life, and I could offer this to you too, listening, is that shadow part of us. Let's assume you've done the work, you've grown, and you've worked on your personality and you're continuing to work on it and you're ready to access some of the shadow stuff. I think shadow stuff comes out, and I mentioned this earlier in the growth part, through triggering. Like when we get triggered as people, what's happening is an aspect of our shadow is making itself known to us. We're seeing that for what it is. And often when we get triggered, we usually want to cut off at the source of what's triggering us. We want to just remove that element because we don't like the feeling that it gives us when it triggers us. Or we try to externalize it and say, well, that's a challenge out here. The trigger's happening out here. It's not my response to what's happening. The trigger itself is the problem. And we try to address the trigger rather than what it's doing to us, because the same event doesn't trigger some people and it triggers others. But to put it on the trigger is to give all the power away in that situation and put it onto the catalyst for how you're feeling. Well, that's simply just your response to what's happening. The same stimuli is a different trigger for somebody else. It might make them happy and it makes you sad. So at that moment, you have to reflect, well, why am I responding to this trigger in this way. Anytime you're triggered in life and you're looking to access that shadow material, you say, what is it about me as a response when this stimuli happens in the outer world and I feel this way or I respond this way? What can I look at in myself to understand more about how I'm wired? And the aspects of myself that are murky, those shadow aspects that are really hard to discover about who I am, that's the moment when you have an opening. It's a very fleeting opening, I think. It's a very challenging opening to take the mental and emotional and intentional effort to focus on it and say, this is probably coming from me. It's probably not coming from the trigger. That takes maturity and a bunch of other things that I think you'll have if you put the attention to growing your personality type in your car model. When you get to the shadow and you start to put yourself in situations where you can be purposefully triggered, you're going to have the skills to process those triggers through the rest of your personality. You have grown.
Yeah.
So I think that's why we phase this in two different phases. You don't just go and start getting yourself triggered everywhere and be like, I got to deal with my shadow material. It's, I have all the resources I need because I've been working on myself and the disciplines of my mind, my heart, my emotions, my thoughts, my intentions, that when I'm triggered, I have the tools that I can dive deep into that.
Yeah. Triggers shouldn't be avoided. They should be worked through. And I don't know if you want to put yourself in a situation where you're like getting triggered all the time by a million different things, because each trigger leads to work that needs to be done. So you probably want to handle them one at a time, especially if they're big ones. But if a person starts to see triggers as a gift, not a curse, then the relationship one has with the outside world radically shifts and alters.
Yeah.
It's no longer that you're on the receiving end of everybody else being a big meanie or the world not caring about your feelings. It's that they've just provided, they've just shone light on something. And that's the only way, by the way, that's the only way we get that light. Jung talked about it multiple times, that the only way we see our shadow is through reflections and mirrors. We need other people to trigger us. We need them to point out those things. And I think we have, to some extent, gotten so far away from shadow work as people that we start to see people, others triggering our ability to see the things in our shadows as being somehow an attack, but it's really an opportunity. So I think it's important. I think you're totally right that triggers are a great place to start to dive down. And if you have language around type, I mean, I'm not even saying that this is like empirically true, but if you have language around type, now you have something that you can focus your attention on. You can use that as a further reflection of what's going on for you. You don't just get the, sort of the stab of the trigger and I guess I have to be in this terrible emotion for a while now. Like, it's not like that. It's like, okay, I got triggered. This is painful. What could this relate to? Maybe something in my past. Well, something in my past is related to what else about me. And I can use these models as a way to almost conceptualize it, give myself a little bit of psychological difference or distance, like maybe emotional distance from the pain, and work on it in a way that feels manageable, not like it's going to overwhelm me, for sure.
Yeah. Like, I could think of an example a long time ago. Like, I was in a business meeting and I was speaking up and someone else was sharing their ideas. And all of a sudden I felt this trigger of competition come up in me. Like, it was like, oh no, they're going to like outdo me in this business meeting situation. And I all of a sudden started to see them as the problem, this person and the ideas they were putting forth, and being like, I was focusing on external things like, well, they cut me off and they're sitting closer to the boss, right? The person that's the supervisor. So they're going to get paid attention to more. They're speaking louder. They're more bombastic and running over the top of people to get their ideas out there. I kept thinking they're the problem, right? And I kept thinking like it was about the thing itself, the conversation we were having and the ideas in the business, completely ignoring that I'm having this emotional response, this competitive emotional response toward this person, thinking they're getting more value and more recognition and all these stories that are going on, narratives in my head. And it's just building and building. And I remember having this moment where I was like, wait a second. Like everybody else in this room isn't responding the same way I am. So this isn't an objective thing in the outer world. This is personal to me. I'm personally responding to this person. No one else is. So why? What is going on there? I started to reflect on myself to say, okay, what part of me feels competitive? What part of me is insecure about the ideas I'm bringing forth? What part of me wishes I could be more like that person? I envy them. They're speaking up more. They're asserting themselves more. They're saying the things I wish I would have said just 2 minutes ago, the ideas I had, they're putting them forward. I wish I'd said that. That was my idea, right? But they're the ones saying it. And now I'm making it about them, but it's really about my response to them. And so this is something I think that we can have happen in our lives all the time. And I think that, again, it can also help us grow our regular, our car model personality, not just our shadow access.
Right.
It's part of a ton of development as people.
Well,
and it's something that I actually appreciate. Like you said, it's an opportunity for me.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to almost cut you off, but I was going to say that I mentioned before that co-pilot work. Oh, I was going to mention it again when we got to the fourth function, but it's actually, Jung talked about how developing that auxiliary part of who we are is, it's a cushion to work in our inferior. Like the parts of us that are in the shadow usually or unconscious for us. Doing more development in that auxiliary function is how we cushion the blow of it. We cushion the sting. And what I heard you just saying basically is that when you felt this trigger, you used your ability to go inside your own intentions and motivations and what you knew about yourself. You studied your own emotional response and reaction to understand yourself more and understand the situation. Well, that's introverted feeling or authenticity work for you.
Right.
And so you used that co-pilot function to cushion the trigger, to make it so that it was a little easier to manage and a little bit more palatable to work through. And so I think so we're talking about getting into the shadow, which is part of, as I mentioned before, phase 2, which is entering the place of archetypes. And you can work on that simultaneously with phase 1, but you have to get to, as I mentioned, a certain point of phase 1 to even be able to access phase 2. And the archetypal energies, and we've created whole podcasts around this, for Jung was what he called persona, ego, shadow, and whole self. And there's other archetypal energies in there, conscious, unconscious, and collective, and that kind of thing. But I think paring it down to those 4 makes it more manageable as people who are looking for individuation, right? People who are looking for a way to understand ourselves. And going back to this idea of taking massive action, once you get to a place where you're working on archetypal energies, action is crucial. You have to be in action to really, really implement this. So the first part is the persona, and the persona is the aspect of ourselves we allow other people access to us, right? Like it's the part of ourselves we're going to show to the outside world. And if we don't have our persona right, it throws everything else off. It's not like we can't have a persona that's fake, or we can, but if we do, we're going to be adding extra burden and weight to the rest of our personality. And so we do need to do persona work, as in not just making sure that we're not fake, but making sure that we are showing up and expressing to the world an accurate reflection of who we are and how we see ourselves with our growing awareness of who we are. So that means that, everybody who's like, well, I'm not going to be fake, I'm not going to play the game, right? But they secretly want success and recognition and status. Well, that person's persona is in a divided place with their true ego and shadow work, meaning that they actually want all the things that come along with playing the game, but they have an attitude and they're not going to play the game. Well, that puts extra burden on their shadow. It puts extra burden on their ego because now it has to pretend something that isn't true in order to convince the outside world of something that isn't honest.
Then the ego comes in, and the ego is the other part of this, where the ego is basically the narrative I have about myself. It's the hero element of me. It's my good part, quote unquote, the parts of me that I'm like, look, I'm a good person. I do the right things. Yeah, I mess up every once in a while. I'll go ahead and give you that. I've got some things about me. I'm not perfect. I mess up a little bit, but I'm a generally good person. I'm trying to do the right thing. I want to be attentive to other people's needs and live a good life. And I think this is where the ego shows up, and it's kind of our champion from within.
Well, and I think, sometimes I talk about the ego as the part of us that's like, I'm a good person. And people will say, well, then I actually really know a lot about my shadow because I see all the bad parts. In fact, I see more bad parts than good parts. I think to some extent we have been propagandized into believing that to be a good person, you have to own all the bad parts. And so in some weird sort of counterintuitive way, owning bad things helps you feel like you're a better intended person, right? And so it's not about being a good person. It's about being a well-intended person. And that's the ego. The ego believes it's always well-intended. It always wants the best. And part of that is acknowledging all the bad parts too. In fact, maybe I'm a more modest and humble person if I see primarily bad stuff inside of me. If I don't see the good, there's this sense that good, like at the core, at the marrow, there's the sense that well-intended good people are the ones who are very in touch with their faults and failings. And so that's still ego as well, right? That can also be ego. It doesn't have to be necessarily shadow work, because when you get to the shadow, it doesn't really care about your intentions. Your shadow is there for defense. It's the unconscious part of you where you shove everything that you can't ameliorate into good intention. It's the part that has all the icky, drossy stuff. And so acknowledging faults is not necessarily a shadow work. It can still be ego work if it always has the patina of I am well-intended. This makes me a good person.
And then the whole self takes in everything. It takes in the ego, the shadow, the persona, the parts we didn't name. Like everything gets part of the whole self. And that's really where we're driving with a growth path using type, using personality type. In our personalities is a whole self. Like we want to find a complete joyful expression of whole self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can see how in phase 2, which is entering archetypal understandings, also requires massive action. Like if your persona is off, if you are presenting yourself in any sort of false front to the rest of the world, you're going to create a further burden on the rest of your conscious and unconsciousness. And that means you have to get your persona right. And persona is a hard thing to really get right. I mean, I've been swimming in this world for over a decade. And I recently realized that my persona has very disingenuous elements to it. Like it's fake. And it was actually associated with another typology system of the Enneagram. But I realized that I have a resistance to things that look good. I have a resistance to it. And it's part of my shadow work to deal with me othering things that look good. We call it sizzle and steak, right? All sizzle, no steak. Well, I have had for a long time an attitude about the concept of sizzle. And it showed up in my persona around myself, and it showed up in the persona of our business. And it was actually starting to undermine everything that I had this push away relationship to sizzle. But that's not an honest part of my identity. I actually like things that are quality. I like when things look good. I like when I look good. Like it really distresses me whenever I don't look good or I think I don't look good. That's like a true honest thing for me. And so I had to acknowledge that I had persona work to do. I have to give everything a facelift. I have to give everything in my life and in the company a facelift so it all looks better, so it can be more in alignment with my true authentic self, because my true authentic self cares about that. But I had an attitude around it based on insecurity that I would never be able to make things look good. I would never be able to look good. And so I had to do a ton of persona work. Well, that persona work has been 6 months to a year of work in our business, right? Moving from systems to other systems, moving from, certain apps that we use and certain ways that we're showing up. Like we are now doing, I would argue, some of the highest volume work that we've done in, at least for me, in years, to be able to get that persona right? That persona was off. So persona work itself requires massive action. And I would argue that ego work does the same, and shadow work does the same, and definitely getting to whole self, because now you have to get in alignment with what is true and honest as you go. So to wrap up this idea of how is introspection, how is understanding your personality, what's the relationship to that and massive action? And the answer is, how is it not? How is it not associated with massive action? How can people be into personality types and not be changing their entire worlds? Like everything should be shifting and altering using this tool that allows us to get more and more individuated, further and further down the rabbit's hole of understanding our whole self.
Yeah. I am thinking about this idea of persona work for you, and actions and massive actions stack on themselves. So your ability, Antonia, to do persona work in the last few months is predicated on the fact that you've taken massive action previous years working on other aspects of your personality. So way back in the day when you left the faith background of your youth, and that faith background, based on their rules, completely cut you out. Friends and family in the faith cut you completely out of all their lives. You were basically shunned. And then you had to put yourself in situations to find out what you truly believed or thought about how your mind was perceiving the world, like what you thought, not what other people told you to think. Taking massive action, letting your life get burned to the ground and restarting, like that set the stage for you to be able to do the work you did more recently. And so you listening right now, just think about where you are on the timeline. You know, we're talking about shadow ego work, persona. Maybe you're not ready for that. Maybe you just discovered your 4-letter code, the 4 letters of your personality type. And your next step is to learn about the CAR model and understand how those 4 letters translate into the cognition of your mind, how you learn information, how you make decisions. Like that's the next phase for you. And the action from going from the 4 letters to the CAR model and the cognition of your mind is the action you need to take right now. And that will be the platform for the next action and the next action and the next action. Cal Newport has this idea of career capital. I think it's Cal Newport that came up with this, right? I hope I got the right author that talks about this. Basically, in your career, learning skills and understanding things that will build over time to make you more employable as a person in the career world. This makes you a more valuable worker, employee, small business owner, whatever. You're building that career capital. I think there's personal capital. I think building your personality type and taking action where you are right now lays the groundwork for more and more action over time. And so I think it stacks on itself and gets more nuanced as you go.
Yeah, I would agree. And so I think having time periods where we're reflective and introspective and figuring out things inside of ourselves, where we're defining terms, when we're trying to sort of noodle something out, I don't think that that's antithetical to taking massive action. I think that they're compatible. I think that they're married to each other. These ideas of taking a moment to pause, get inside of ourselves, introspect, figure a little bit more out about ourselves, and then acting based on that knowledge. So massive action isn't something that we're not bulldozers that are only ever constantly doing things. We're people who have, things come in waves. And sometimes it's time for us to noodle something through, and sometimes it's time for us to act on what we've just noodled through.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the right balance. And so sometimes the podcast will be like, rah, 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 go do shit. And sometimes the podcast will be, okay, let's think about this concept for a while and try to create a distinction around it. And then sometimes it will be rah, 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 go do shit. And then sometimes it will be like, well, what does this thing mean for us? And that's, I think that's the right balance.
Well, of course, we're not saying that you can't stop and learn something.
Right.
But we do have the phrase, we've talked about this before, true learning equals behavior change.
Right.
Like if you truly learn and understand something, that's going to result in some behavior change. Otherwise, you really didn't learn it or make it your own, like really bring it in. You just kind of referenced it. Mm-hmm. But if you truly learn something, I think it equals behavior change. So you've been listening along to our conversation. You've been the third person here without a microphone, but we do want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story about how these things are showing up for you. Where are you at on your growth journey? Have you taken massive action? Are you in a learning phase right now? Where are you at on the timeline of personality type? And I know, Antonia, you usually do like a nice closing pitch and talk about, liking and subscribing and all that. But do all that. Go like and subscribe wherever you can. But I want to really focus in on an action I think you can take today that will help move the needle for you in your life. We've just released, at the time of this recording, and if you're listening in the future, they're going to be out already, 16 brand new programs, one for each of the personality types in the Myers-Briggs system. So there's 16 different types. We have 16 different what's called owner's manuals. So it'll be your type owner's manual. These are available, and they walk you through the process of understanding that 4-letter code, the dichotomies, and then engineering, taking that code and then basically identifying and figuring out where your car model lies. So you can find out the cognition, the wiring of your mind, how you learn information, how you make decisions. And we know that now you've got a growth path in front of you to start taking action on. You can start taking action in your life. And this owner's manual for your personality type talks about that. It lays out the path for you to grow and to apply this to your life as the substrate, as the platform for deeper work, which is something we're eager to do with you. As you develop your personality, as you learn more, we're looking to go down into phase 2 of shadow ego work persona. But it requires a group of people that already know themselves, that have some of these basics handled. And so a great place for you to start, especially if you're new, is in one of these owner's manuals. And you can find those over at personalityhacker.com. Find the type that is your type. If you don't know your type, we also have a test or an assessment you can take to identify which type is your best fit type. And then you can start your growth path with one of these owner's manuals.
So do I do the thing?
I don't know.
I don't know what to do if I don't do the thing.
We'll go ahead and do the thing anyway. Just want to draw attention to that.
My introverted sensing or memory 3-year-old is like, what do I do? What do I do? Okay. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it in all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. We have owner's manuals that are designed for your personality type. It tells you about your dichotomies. It tells you about your cognitive functions or your car model. And it gives you strategies for navigating your personality to become the best version of yourself. We're super excited about them. We put a ton of time and effort into them. So we recommend you go check them out. Head over to personalityhacker.com and find the owner's manual that is right for your personality type.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.